Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Maritime CEO Leader Series, powered by the Ocean Technologies Group. Today, we will be discussing perhaps maybe the single most important issue that shipping faces as the coronavirus recedes, just where the most important nation that has affected the industries throughout this century will be going and how the rest of the world will be interacting with China. So joining us today from the UK is an old China hand and our go-to guy for all things China economy since we founded our company 8 years ago. It's Paul French. Paul had a company in Shanghai called Access Asia, and he has consulted with many leading banks around the world, many Fortune 500 companies going into China. He also happens to be an award-winning author. So let's just start with what you're seeing in terms of some green shoots of recovery. Is China getting back on track? What are you seeing?
Well, China's getting back to work, but that's not quite the same as green shoots of recovery. I mean, this has been a disastrous period. April best would be a 16% fall in shipments. Worst would be 20% plus fall in shipments. That's just for April. That would be the worst since 1976. So 1976, the Cultural Revolution is just finishing. Mao is ailing, and there was a massive earthquake in Tangshan, which, interestingly, considering some of the accusations about coronavirus, Chinese government covered up for quite a while that it had even happened. So that was a disastrous year for China. And that's where we're back to. Imports into China are probably down around 12 to 15% year on year for April. They're not going to get much better in May. So container traffic is what, 15, 17% down on the second quarter last year. So it's not looking good. What it relies on to get back and running is two things, really, both of which really the government can't overly control. The first is a rebound in consumer demand. As everyone knows, and we've talked about a lot in the magazine, China's policy has been one of rebalancing to move away from just exports and investment towards developing the consumer economy. And China has been the most compelling, amazing consumer story now for 15 years. Now, will people come back out and shop? Well, when the restrictions were lifted in many places, we saw like a sudden burst, but that would be expected anyway. When they lift the restrictions here in the UK, we're going to see a sudden flood to the stores, all the people that are going to need a new washing machine because their one broke during this time, all of that sort of thing. And although you can stimulate consumer demand with easy credit, with retailers doing sales, all sorts of ways like that, you can even argue, as they do in China sometimes, that to shop is patriotic. You can't literally force people to go to the shop and buy something if they decide they'd like to save their money or if they just don't have any money. So that's an issue. The second lever that they can pull to try and get green shoots is, of course, one that's really out of their control completely, which is global demand. The only way they can have green shoots is if the orders come back. At the moment, the factories are not getting orders. And for a long time, of course, the factories weren't receiving orders. And in fact, we heard story after story, and many of your listeners and readers will have experienced this, of people phoning Chinese factories around Chinese New Year and for the period afterwards, and just nobody picking up the phone. Now, if that was the case at the factory that you were calling, that factory can't be overly surprised if you've gone and found another supplier somewhere else during that period, right? If I keep on phoning and phoning and phoning my bank, eventually I decide to change banks if they don't answer. So those two things, I think, are absolutely crucial, and there's only a limited amount of stuff the government can do about it. At the same time as well, but I think it's inevitable that Donald Trump is going to put more tariffs on China between now. We have an election coming in November in one form or another. He is going to go after it. China is clearly going to be the demon bogeyman issue in the American election on both sides. And so that as well is going to hinder green shoots.
Okay, let me just dive in there and just set the scene for the next part of the discussion. You mentioned Trump, you mentioned the election cycle coming up. Yeah, and there's a lot of talk in the media about, well, what does this mean in terms of bringing manufacturing closer to home? We've seen Shinzo Abe in Japan kind of call on Japanese manufacturers to bring some of their factories back to Japan. In France, Macron has talked about bringing strategic manufacturing nearer to home. The fact is, though, China, it's got the greatest supply chain ecosystem ever invented. We're not going to see some wholesale shift where China becomes far less dominant in the world of manufacturing, are we?
Well, every time something really bad happens in China, we have this discussion. I'm old enough to remember having this discussion in 1989 after Tiananmen, and things did happen after Tiananmen. The European Union did impose a ban on selling arms to China. British Aerospace and the French munitions companies weren't happy about, but that and it's still largely in place. We had this debate in 2003 around SARS. That's really when people started seriously talking about what was called then the China +1 or China +2 strategy, where you diversify out from just relying on China. And it's gone on and on ever since. We've got people who are very unsteady about investing in China, who talk a lot about China +1. And we've got the China bulls, the people who are really linked to China in terms of foreign business people. And this is always the argument you get from the US, UK, EU chambers of commerce, those kind of people who are very wedded to it. Now you have to be careful of their arguments because their jobs are based in China and that's where they want to be. So of course, if you see your future as China, you tend to not argue to diversify away from China. If you're in Southeast Asia and you're looking at the world, you tend to argue for diversification. But we all know the problems backwards and forwards. The problems are that even if you were to get better supply chains running, and of course, you would need better ports and infrastructure throughout Southeast Asia. Still, just in population terms, it only can take some of it. On the other hand, China has all sorts of other problems that aren't related to coronavirus or anything at the moment, which is, the demographic is shifting upwards. It doesn't have that endless amount of people to migrate from the countryside to factories. It doesn't have that endless amount of young people. What we always used to talk about, the endless numbers of young women with good eyesight and nimble fingers for the textile trade and so on. They're not necessarily around anymore. So there is an issue. Then the other side of the issue is the strategic sovereignty issue, if you like, which is, what Abe would say, for instance, is, that they made a bet on China. Many other countries have done this, but Japan, particularly because of regional proximity, more so than, say, Germany or the UK or the US. So you've made a bet on China, which is you've shifted everything there. I mean, you really have almost done exclusive reliance on China, and that's a problem. So we don't see so many Japanese factories throughout Southeast Asia, or even now in Korea. And really, it was Japanese investment in Korea that got the whole South Korean economic miracle going as well. They've gone very exclusively into China. It was always a risky strategy for them due to long-held grievances and so on. And now I think Abe would like to get out. But I think that there'll be a lot of talk about we need to shift things away. We need to bring back strategic industries. And of course, people like perhaps Boris Johnson in Britain and Trump in America, of course, and Macron in France, in their own different political voices, do see it as a way of perhaps creating jobs, boosting the economy and so on. I think that the Japanese see a slightly different issue. I think that Japan at the moment sees the political risk of China as being very, very high. And we can talk about a quick checklist of what those political risks are, because they are things all of us should be thinking about. But I think Japan is the one country that is looking at China and saying that it's very high on the political risk list. Whereas I think, obviously, Trump and the Make America Great Again campaign, Johnson and Brexit, Macron and the kind of eternal return of the glory of France, is kind of thinking of it in terms of bringing jobs home. There's a separate issue there, because when you start doing all that, you've then got to encounter your own domestic environmental lobby, which will not necessarily welcome that. And that puts them, all of us, in a kind of ethical bind about returning industry back to where it came from.
We were talking the other day, on a far more macro basis, suddenly when people in Kent, where I'm originally from, are told to go and pick their own strawberries, they might not be so keen to do these sort of things.
Nobody likes low wages and kids working in factories, yet everyone goes to Zara and fast fashion brands and everything because they want cheap clothes. Everybody wants more health service. Nobody wants to pay more tax, right? I mean, this is the eternal conundrum. What we see about returning industry is that it's a very attractive, particularly if you're in northern France or northeast England or Midwest America. This is a very attractive proposition. But the world has moved on in many ways. Consider this statistic for China, which you don't hear a lot, which is every export from China requires at least one import into China. So in order to make anything that comes from China, something has to be imported. A component, a raw material, energy, something has to be imported. So if you're going to bring manufacturing home, that equation is going to apply as well. And that means that you're going to have more cargo planes landing at your airports, which may require more runways, which is a very hot topic here where I am in the southeast of England. You are going to require more ships to come to your ports. This would be a sign of a flourishing economy, more imports coming in to make more exports to go out. But as you guys have written about a lot, more SOx, more NOx, more ships steaming around the world. So yes, it's good. It seems like a solution. And this puts the green lobby and the environmental lobby in a bind as well, because what are you going to do? Oppose jobs, oppose apprenticeships, oppose economic rejuvenation, oppose greater industrial sovereignty at a time when a lot of your industrial sovereignty has gone to a country that, and let's be quite frank about this, China's popularity rating is at an all-time low. So, you know, are you going to maintain that? You know, I can remember, to give an anecdote of this, I can remember in the last year or two of the Blair administration here in Britain, being literally almost thrown out of the Foreign Office here in Whitehall when Blair announced that his target of reducing Britain's carbon emissions by 1% as a kind of big flag-waving start to reducing carbon emissions, he had achieved it. And when it was pointed out, and that job fell to me, unfortunately, when it was pointed out to him that a large part of the reason that he had managed to do that was that they had sold MG Rover to Nanjing Auto and shut down the Longbridge plant, which led to masses of job losses, not just in the car plant, but of course in all the shops and the pubs and everything around Longbridge and in the Midlands of England and around Birmingham. I was nearly thrown out because making the argument that cheering to having cut emissions by exporting emissions to Nanjing really isn't a very global way of looking at things. So bringing back industry, whether it's to Japan or France or Britain or America, is very politically interesting at the moment, but it has consequences. There are knock-ons to that, but less so in Japan, where I think there's, as I said, a more political risk, and I think we should mention that political risk. Macron, Johnson, and all the others are going to have to get their heads around everything. And remember, you know, one of Johnson's campaign issues was around not wanting a third runway at Heathrow and various other issues. Everyone wants to please the industrial heartland. Nobody wants to look like they're in bed with China at the moment, but also nobody wants to annoy the large environmental lobby in Western countries.
Okay, let's finish, as we always do in this series, your cultural lockdown little survey. And for those that don't already, can I recommend that you check out Paul's Twitter feed, China Rhyming, where you will get quite a lot of book recommendations. So, a TV binging, books, podcasts. I know you're a big podcast fan. What have you been doing during the lockdown to keep you amused?
I'm going to recommend a TV show. In the UK, it's on the Amazon streaming service. And I'm going to recommend it because it does have boats in it. It's an American show called Patriot, which is about intelligence services. It is perfect for binge watching. There's lots going on. It talks about the geopolitical situation around the world, America getting up to all sorts of nefarious activities. And as I say, I'm not going to give the plot away as a spoiler, but boats become quite integral to the denouement of the whole thing. I ignored it like a lot of people for a lot of time because I thought this sounds like some kind of mad right-wing TV show or something, but it's not. It's a very funny take on the idea of patriotism and loyalty. Again, talking about ships, I'm going to recommend a really great podcast that I got completely hooked on. It's Australian, and it's a joint production, I think, of the Age newspaper and the Sydney Morning Herald. And it's called The Last Voyage of the Pong Su. And I think people in shipping will know the story of the Pong Su, which was this North Korean rust bucket freighter that ended up just down from Melbourne and was seen erratically going up and down the coast there in terrible conditions. And what it was trying to do was land about $100 million worth of heroin that was obviously being produced and sold by, at the time, Kim Jong-il regime in North Korea. Well, it all went a bit wrong. The Australian police were on it and they got them. And the Pong Su, the ship, was eventually by the Australian Navy and Coast Guard taken in. And the whole podcast is about what the hell they were doing and where this heroin came from and who was selling it, and how this rust bucket that out of Nampo that previously hadn't gone much further than sort of the Sea of Japan found itself all the way down in Australia, and what happened to the crew and particularly the captain, what life was like on board. Also, it's very interesting at the moment because when we talk about North Korea, which is another subject I know we've spoken about a lot, it seems to me that right now, if you look at the sanctions regime that's still in place on North Korea, it really is starting to bite with Chinese support. And the one area that really changed it, everyone sort of casually says, oh, well, when China joined the sanctions, which they sort of half-heartedly did, that's when it really got tough for Pyongyang. But it's not true, I don't think. When it really got tough for Pyongyang was when the United Nations and the United States particularly got tough on North Korean maritime. Maritime was the lifeline for North Korea to the world, and all of this reflagging under Tuvalu and all of that, and putting these ships around, not just in terms of them going further and further out to get fish and seafood, but sailing, whether it be heroin or parts for nuclear weapons. You know, they were very, very dependent on maritime. So cracking down on maritime, going through the registries, putting sanctions on people that were trying to claim to set up private shipping companies in North Korea and things to register and flag ships that we don't know what the hell they were up to. This is really, really interesting. And this podcast, you know, is going back and looking at 2003 and the way that North Korea was using its maritime fleet, such as it is, for nefarious activities. And it's still obviously something that's important. So that's good. And also, you know, Asian companies are all going to be in trouble. We know they're there. And I think Robert Bicker's new book, China Bound, which it's a lockdown read because it's like that thick and it's really good. And it's a history of Swire and Co. And anyone who, of course, knows Hong Kong and Asia will know Swire. And if you know Australia, New Guinea, I mean, they're everywhere, Swire now. But this goes back to when they started out in Liverpool, importing dyeing chemicals from Germany, shipping to New Orleans, going down to Australia, and of course, out to Asia.
Paul also writes a books column for Maritime CEO, as well as covering the China economy for us. So if you like the cut of his jib, do check out our magazine. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, Paul, and we'll be back on Thursday. In the meantime, stay sane and sanitized, everyone. Thank you.